morning. Welcome to our clearly New Year's Day service. Please join us as we sing.
Hearts and full night flowers before the opening. Hey, so we've got a new series we'll kick off in January, and it'll be even more fun when there's even more people here. For today, though, you get in on the ground level of all of this, and so you get to gather your thoughts ahead of time. And so really what I want to do in the month of January as a group of people that are trying to make the most of our opportunity to do something with Jesus in 2017, meaning to do something to open up our hearts, to shine light, to bring light to darkness. What I want to do in January is really think through, are we doing the best that we could possibly do? And really, for the rest of the time that I'm connected to Waters Avenue Baptist Church, every year I want to spend January asking this question. I think it's really, really important. Are we doing what we could do? What did not work last year? What did work last year? How do we tap more resources that we're spending into what did work and stop doing what didn't work? And so I want to hear from everybody. I want to hear from me. I want to hear from you. I want to hear from us. And that's what we'll be doing in January. And so this series about definitions is really, really important because I think at the root of all of this, we need to agree on some terms. Because if we don't get our terms right, then we automatically set a wrong trajectory. I think words hold power to set direction. And so if your words are defined incorrectly, then your trajectory is going to be wrong. So for example, if you define faith as it goes that way, but in reality faith goes this way, your whole trajectory is off. Here's what I mean by getting to the root cause of definitions or semantics. The phrase, I'm sorry, and the phrase, my bad, mean the same thing, unless you're at a funeral. If you're at a funeral, one is an expression of sympathy, and the other is an admission of guilt. You killed that person, and that's what you mean by my bad. So I'm sorry and my bad do mean the same thing, but there are circumstances where they mean the opposite thing. Where at a funeral you would be saying, I'm sorry for your loss, and the other one would be, I didn't know I'd kill him. And so that is what semantics are all about. Semantics are looking at the context where words could mean two different things. But you have to look into the context of where the word is spoken to figure out what it means in that context or according to that person. What do they mean by it? Now, obviously, as a church, we do that all the time. We do it all the time with the Bible. We're constantly pulling that out. But there are some terms on the screen that I think every year, okay, they're still up there, that every year we've got to slow down and say, what do these terms mean? That first one is the term that we'll look at today in regards to faithfulness. Because faithfulness is this word that is thrown out in Christianity all the time. We just want to be faithful. We just want to be faithful in 2017. I've tried to be faithful all my life. I've tried to, all of those things, faithful and faithfulness. What does that term mean? Because that's what we're trying to do. It's the reason you showed up today. You wanted to be faithful to your commitment to be in church every Sunday. And so you're here. Or you wanted to show up and be faithful to your group of people that you are journeying through life together with. So you're faithful to agree to meet up and to do life together here. Or a number of different reasons. But what does that mean? And so we'll look at some words that we all kind of know, and we really do know, but in some sense we'll be surprised by some of the ways that we ultimately can define these things. Now, Jesus, that one's a little more defined, but I think we can find a couple of things that will, all in defining these, even the Jesus, that we can unify a little bit more around agreeing on those terms. Because I think that's important. Several people will say, oh yeah, I love Jesus. You ever heard someone say, I love Jesus? And you're like, not the Jesus I know. You know? That's what I mean by semantics. So what do you mean when you say Jesus? What do you mean when you say Christianity? As a church, we got to have a working definition of that. Because if we don't have clear definition, then we're not going to be as united as we possibly could. And that's why I'm proposing every January we go through a series called Definitions, and we realign around these things. Okay, enough about that. Let's just jump in quickly here. I'm going to be in Matthew 25 this morning to kick off on this term of faithfulness. And what does faithfulness really mean? Faithfulness is really actually, I think, the opposite of what people think it means. So I want to today rock your world by telling you your definition of faithfulness is dead wrong. And so I'll just put the cards on the table right there, and I'll get there in just a minute. Have you ever received bad advice? Or have you ever given bad advice? Remember in my neighborhood, there was a kid who had a sprained ankle. And I remember telling him, hey, just walk it off. Because that's what I'd always heard, walk it off. And most of the time when I would fall and there'd be an adult around or a coach, and I'd say, oh, my knee hurts, they would say, walk it off. So I was young, and I remember telling this kid, walk it off. By the end of the day, when his ankle was the size of a cantaloupe and his mom caught wind of what was happening, she came out, yelled at him, yelled at me, took him inside to take care of him. Because you don't just walk off those things. I mean, that was one piece of bad advice that I remember giving, and I know I've given a lot more bad advice ever since then. But that was one of the earliest memories and where it really all started. It is good advice to walk it off, but in that situation, that was not good advice. I received bad advice before. I was in college. Amanda and I had been dating for about a year and a half. Many of you know this story. And we were going through some growing pains in our relationship, and I was like, I don't even know if we're compatible at this point, because we are seemingly bickering about so many different things that this early in a relationship, I don't know. So I asked the person who was the most influential person in my life at the time, who was my youth pastor. This guy had it together. He always had it together. And I asked him, what would you do? What do you think? And he said, well, Darren, God's not the author of confusion. So maybe this isn't of God. And I was like, oh, and I started to internalize that and think about that and broke up with Amanda. Well, we're married today, so that was bad advice. It was really bad advice. To this day, Amanda brings that up. And it's like, how dare you? And I'm like, well, I'm the one who had to come crawling back to you, all right? It ended with me being humiliated. And she always references just sitting there being humiliated by me at that table. And I was like, I didn't broadcast to the world like what we were talking about. And I was the one who came crawling back. So, but that's it. That is a dark cloud that is perpetually over my marriage the rest of my life because of the bad advice that a youth pastor gave me. Youth pastors. Anyhow, there's a lot of bad advice in the world. I watched a segment the other day, and you'll hear this on the news and on the radio all the time. It cracks me up. There was, and I know some people may say what I'm about to say is you're misunderstanding it. No, I wasn't misunderstanding this segment on the news. I was watching the news. It was probably Good Morning America. And on Good Morning America, they bring up this new series that they're doing in this whole new movement about body proud. You guys familiar, body proud. Be proud of the body that you live in. And I think it was on that show where the segment ended where this woman who had never bought a bikini before because she thought, I would never look good in a bikini, bought a bikini for the first time. They bring her out. She looks at herself in the mirror, and they're like, yeah, I love the body you're in. And I was like, sounds good. Culture likes to define what beauty is. I get it. Okay. Very next segment. Now, on to how obesity can kill all of us and the body you're living in. And I was just like, I'm so confused. Did they not, and don't get me wrong, right? We shouldn't be depressed. We shouldn't get so down about the body that we're living in. But you can't put those two segments side by side. And they did. And that stuff happens all the time. I could go on and on, but it would be too politically sharp or controversial as it relates to current topics. But that stuff happens all the time, and it's like, well, one of those has to be bad advice. Or you need to synthesize your message a little bit better. Because I think both are good advice. But the way you just said it, that was bad advice. There's a lot of bad advice in churches. Churches are picking up on the message of just be yourself. Be yourself. Be true to who you are. And I'm not trying to be that hellfire and brimstone guy that says, don't be who you are. But seriously, the Bible's message is don't be who you are. The Bible's message is die to yourself and be more like Jesus. And so I don't know how the church can pick up on this message and all of its ambiguity and say just be yourself. I don't think we're trying to get anybody to just be yourself. Now, in being yourself, bringing your creative genius to the world and the creativity that you can to make things better, absolutely. But within the context and the means of Jesus' means and teaching, absolutely. So there's bad advice in the church. But here's the bad advice that I'm going headstrong at today, and I want to go headstrong at for the next 12 months as a church. And that bad advice, that really, really bad advice, is the advice of being faithful. People in Christianity have said over and over and over again, just be faithful. God just wants you to be faithful. That's true. But when they say it, and the semantics that they're saying it in, it is bad advice, and it is some of the worst and most costly advice to ever be propagated. As we turn a new year, and it's a new year in your life, it's a new year in our church's life, God does not want us just to be faithful. And what that means is keep doing what you're doing if it's not working. And that's what I mean. The notion of be faithful is a way of making people feel better. This is at least my experience. That term has become, or that phrase has been a phrase that has helped people feel better when they're failed. Hey, you've royally, royally failed. It's okay, just be faithful. In other words, just keep doing what you're doing and be faithful to it. And what I want to say is, no, don't just be faithful. Be smart about that and figure out what did not work and stop it. And figure out what does work and do it. Accomplishing nothing is not a Christian option, and it's not Christian at all. This phrase has been the spiritual means to justify laziness and poor management of churches all the time. Now, here's why I know that. The word faithful appears 48 times in the New Testament. Not once does it equate or connect faithful with justification for a lack of results. Because that's kind of what that phrase has always meant. That man, you know, I always hear this expression in terms of like pastors who are just running churches into the ground. That's where I think of this phrase the most. He's just being faithful. You mean he's just failing, right? That's what you mean. He's just failing. That's what he's doing. That is, he's just being faithful. And then the encouragement that comes to that pastor is just keep being faithful. We would never say that to anyone ever about any other circumstances outside the walls of Christianity. If a man was driving down the road with his family in the car and he kept making wrong turn after wrong turn, and the wife is saying, why don't you just stop for directions? He's not allowed to say, honey, I'm just being faithful. That doesn't work. Because when it doesn't work, you're not being faithful, you're being a failure. You need to stop what you're doing and start doing something that works. Now, like I said, the word faithful appears 48 times in the New Testament. Not once does it ever give justification to anybody who's just failing, and Paul never uses it to say, just keep doing what you're doing. Never once does it do that. Not once does faithful justify a lack of results or a lack of accomplishing something. 16 times the word faithful in the New Testament, when it's used, is a reference to God being faithful. So we're never going to learn anything from that necessarily, right? It's not like, here's the prescription for a human being being faithful. No, it's basically just trust that God will be faithful to accomplish the things that he's promised to do. That's 16 times, that's how the word is used. 12 times it's a reference to someone being called faithful. Joseph is called faithful. The people of Ephesus are called faithful. Tychicus, Onesimus, Antipas, Silas, Moses is called faithful. Paul calls himself faithful, the humble one that he always is, calls himself faithful, a faithful steward. But then there are ambiguous references to people to being faithful without enough context or context clues to shape the meaning of faithful for us. And then finally, there are references to deacons being faithful, their wives needing to be faithful. But really never is there enough context clues, is what we called it in elementary school. There were never really enough context clues to really figure out, like, what does this word faithful mean? It just says be faithful, be faithful. And I think that's the reason that the majority of Christians have used this term, just keep doing what you think God wants you to do despite the results. But there is one text in the New Testament which uses this word faithful, and in its context helps us to look at what does it really mean to be faithful. What does it mean as a church for us to be faithful to what God would want us to be doing here? And that is Matthew 25. Matthew 25 has some strong language, though. So I think we need to tone it down a little bit. We need to look at it from a big picture. But let me just read to you Matthew 25 and look at this parable is what we're going to look at. that describes faithful servants and unfaithful servants. Verse 14 is where I'd begin. We're going to go all the way down through verse 30. Again, Jesus says, there will come a day, and it'll be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more bags. Verse 17. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. It's just so funny and ridiculous. I love it. And this guy just literally dug a hole in the ground. But you know what? It was probably more common practice than I realized because you didn't have a bank. So he probably really did dig a hole in the ground. Verse 19, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Verse 22, the man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags. See, I've gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. Therefore, I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and by the way, this is why I don't think the master is perfectly supposed to be God, unless we're supposed to think God is a hard man reaping where he's not sowed. But what Jesus is saying is the crux of this idea is what I want you to get. So keep going. Gathering where you've not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. What he was saying was, I took the no-risk path. I didn't spend a dime so that I knew with certainty I could give you back 100% of what you entrusted me with. Just stop right there. Is that not the Christian definition of faithfulness? Man, that's what I hear all the time. Just be sure to give back what God gave you. As you keep reading, though, it doesn't go well. His master replied, verse 26, you wicked, lazy servants. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit, at least with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. Verse 28, so take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Being faithful is not a good thing. Here's what I mean, though. The way that we define faithful, typically, is not what God wants from us. God doesn't want us to dig holes in the ground just to be careful and just do what it is that we know are the actions that we should be doing. What God wants, apparently, are results. Now, people don't like that. And people don't like it mainly because for hundreds of years, or at least 100 years as churches, we've begun to say that faithfulness has to do with doing the right things with no eye on what the results are. So let me give you a couple of quick thoughts on this. When someone says God just wants us to be faithful, stop that person and say, no, he doesn't. He wants results. And the guy who was just being faithful was called wicked and lazy. Okay, that wasn't a thought, but that was just an aside. Number one, faithfulness and results are the same thing. In this parable, they are the same thing. Faithfulness is not an action that may produce results. Faithfulness is the totality of actions that got to results. Faithfulness and results are the same thing. Look at verse 20 and 21 again and see what I mean. Verse 20, the man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5, I've gained 5. And his master said, well done, good and savvy. No. Well done, good and faithful. He was faithful because he got results. He was faithful because his actions produced something more. He uses the word faithful specifically with the servant who produced something. Because he doubled what he was given, he was told, well done, and he was called good and faithful. Now, in case you still think faithfulness without results is possible, look at verses 24 through 26 again. Verse 24, then the man who had received one bag of gold came, Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting what you've not sown, gathering what you've not scattered. So I was afraid. I went and hid it in the ground. Here is what belongs to you. And by the way, can you see the emphasis? I just wanted to give you back 100% of what you gave me. 100% of what you gave me. And the guy goes, that's not what I wanted at all. Who told you to do that? Where did you get this idea from, is what the master says, that was a good idea. Hundreds of years of church telling me just be faithful. So if you keep going, he ends it all by saying, you're wicked and lazy servants. And then later he's called worthless. Now, worthless is tough, but let's be honest. His actions were worthless actions, right? So maybe we don't want to call the people worthless because no one's worthless. But the actions certainly were, because nothing happened. That was why. Why do that? So two logical conclusions or continuations from this thought that faithfulness and results do happen to be the same thing. And if you're uneasy right now, I think I'll make you a little less uneasy with some of these conclusions. One, faithfulness. If faithfulness and results are the same thing, then two things. One, faithfulness is doing what produces results. Kind of saying the same thing, I know, but it's important to clarify. If you found what produces results, then keep doing it. That is being faithful. That is being faithful with whatever it is that God has given you that you can use to produce good for the world. If what you're doing is not producing results, that's called failure. So what should a person do, or what should a church do, if what they are doing, or if some of what they're doing, or what a small portion of what they're doing does not produce results? Should the church close their doors, or talk about it in terms of an individual? If an individual has this calling of God, and they're out doing what God has called them to do, and yet there are no results, what should that person do? Should they stop trying? That's what most churches would say. Most churches would say, well, then fine, we'll just call it a day then if that's all that it's about. Fine, we'll just give up. If it's not right, I've had people where I've said, hey, look, I don't know if what you're doing is really a calling of God because no one wants what you're selling. No one cares what you're doing. Why not do something with all of that time, with all that money that is guaranteed to produce some type of result? And they say, well, you know what? And I've even had people go so far as to say, well, if God doesn't like it, then fine. I won't do anything. That's what arrogant, selfish, stubborn people say in response to this idea that faithfulness and results are the same thing. The answer is, if what you're doing does not produce results, then just stop doing what you're doing and do something else. That's all it is. If faithfulness is doing what produces results, and what you're doing doesn't produce results, just start doing what does. That's it. That's being faithful. That is how you can be faithful in failure. You ever heard the line, I should have looked it up and written it down, from Thomas Edison, that there's no such thing as failure because he learned something from every time he failed till eventually he accomplished what he accomplished. That's how you be faithful in failure. Failure is not a bad thing, provided you learn what not to do and you learn what to do from it. And so that is what faithfulness is all about. Faithfulness is doing what produces results, so we should just stop doing what doesn't produce results. As an individual, as a church, as a society, as anybody who's been entrusted with anything, faithfulness is being committed that if what you're doing isn't working, changing it to do more of what you are doing that does work. Because we're all doing something that works. And so do more of that and do less of what doesn't work. So number one, faithfulness is doing what produces results. And number two, faithfulness is stopping what isn't producing results. Unfaithfulness, then, is doing what doesn't produce results. Unfaithfulness is continuing to do what doesn't produce results for the rest of your life. The phrase, God just wants you to be faithful, has become a way to say, just keep doing what has never worked. And do it as if it's a calling of God. But it's not. In society, we'll say it a little bit different. In society, we say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. In churches, we say the definition of faithfulness is doing the same thing and expecting different results. This is why this is bad advice from the church, bad advice from pastors, bad advice from Christians who have promoted a lie. It's not the same. You can fail and still be faithful. In being faithful, you just stop doing what isn't working. So then, if you spend time, as I said before, skip that. When people say to somebody, just keep keeping on because they failed, I want to scream as loud as I possibly can. Do not keep keeping on. To a pastor who's pastoring a dying church, I just want to say, don't keep keeping on. That is an expensive form of failure. Stop it. Close it up. Or change something. Change something. Figure out what's not working and start doing what will work. That is the advice that needs to be given. I've thought this often. Do you know how many churches there are across Tampa that have like 10 people in them? Lots of them. They all have someone who's helping substantially pay the bills, keep the electricity on, keep the buildings up. If those churches filled with 10 people would combine their resources and form a church of 200 people, they would be fat rich in their budget. Why reinvent the wheel by yourself? See, what I'm saying is that is not faithful. That is foolish. And so, look at your life as an individual, and as we roll into a new year and you ask, what do I need to do to be faithful to God this year? My question would be, what did you do last year to try to bring peace and justice to the world that had little to no results? Whatever that was, stop doing that. And start doing something new this year that will have direct results to your actions. Because actions are not good enough. Results are what we're responsible for. Right? It would be like saying that there is someone, or it would be like the Good Samaritan running down into the ditch to pick the guy up out of the ditch, and as he picks him up, the victim just slips out of his hands and he falls in the ditch and he goes, oh well, I tried. And he goes on his way. That's not how it works. That Good Samaritan had 10 things he had to do to ensure that the end result was that the guy in the ditch was taken care of. And so potentially your Good Samaritan efforts last year, you were doing one of 10 things that were required. Maybe you need to do the same thing, but you need to do it with more vigor. Maybe you need to stop doing that and figure out what only requires 3 things instead of 10, because you in your life don't have time to do 10 things. Whatever it is, every single one of us individually are called to produce results with the life that you've been given, with the money that you've been given, with the energy that you've been given from God. And so, stop doing what doesn't work. Do more of what did work for you. Lastly, this all applies to us as a church. As a church, we have to ask those exact same questions. As a church, what did we do last year that worked? We need to do more of that. What did we do last year that did not work? We need to stop doing that. The problem with this is that this is called change. And churches that are filled with senior citizens don't like it. Churches that are filled with millennials don't like it. Churches that are filled with every generation between don't like being told that what you did last year or the year before was a failure. But that's insane. We have got to look back on what is not working and stop it and move to things that are working. And that is what I propose we do for the month of January. For the month of January, what I want to do is to look at ourselves introspectively within the lens of this parable about being faithful and figure out how do we get more out of our time, more out of our effort, and more out of the money that we're spending in order to run this place that's called Waters Avenue Baptist Church. I want to scrutinize what we're doing and figure out how to make it better. Now, we always come back and we talk about a budget that we have as a church. We'll always talk about fixed spending that we have, but there's no way to change that spending. Great. If we can't change that spending, then the question is not should we spend less in that area to get the same results? The real question that I would ask is how do we get more results out of that same spending if we can't change that spending? We all need to be asking that question. How do we get more results? Or how do we spend less so that we can take money from one area and spend it more on what does work? If we can't shift spending around when we're talking about money-wise, then how do we put more effort into what we have to spend money on to produce more results? How do we get more streamlined in that? And by the way, I want everything about what we do to be on the table, to be willing to be slain as the idol that it might be. And let's do that. Because here's the question. Here's what I always think about. And I think there's a very clear answer to this, but this is how I always gauge things, and this is how I want all of us to think. We have about an operating budget of $100,000. I'm going to round it off at $100,000. We'll call it 90. Let's say it's 90. For $90,000, you could fund 8 wells across the world in 2017. With $90,000, you could fund 8 wells. You could bring clean drinking water to 8 villages. You could save countless lives with $90,000. The burden on you and the burden on me is to ask ourselves, is what we're doing as Waters Avenue Baptist Church more important than funding those wells? That is an awful question. But that is the way that we should steward the money that we spend as a church. And if it is fixed income, listen, this is the thing. This is why I make outlandish statements. I'd be perfectly fine to sell all of these buildings and meet under a tree if that would allow us to fund 8 wells every year. But that may not be the right answer. The right answer maybe needs to be, Darren, you big dummy, you're so short-sighted. What if we did fill this room? And we filled this room with people, but we filled this room with Jesus week after week after week, and that Jesus made his way into the hearts of everybody who came into this room, to where at the end of 5 years, you had 200 people committed to funding wells, and now you are funding 24 wells a year. But the litmus test to are we doing what we can do and spending money the way that we should spend money comes down to, in 2017, will what we accomplish be more valuable than funding 8 wells across the world and saving the lives of kids that are dehydrated and dying? That question should haunt you. That question haunts me. And now take it beyond our money and take it to time. Don't come to Waters Avenue Baptist Church if coming here isn't making you more of a person who will produce more justice for the world. Find another church. Or come to Chris, come to me, come to Tim, come to anybody in this room and say, the content on Sunday mornings at this church stinks. I'm not getting changed by it. We need to know that. If the sermons stink, throw them out the window. I went to school for 4 years to learn how to do this, but I would burn this up gladly if it's just not working. You could tell me you're the worst preacher I've ever heard. And I would say, who do we need to get to change you, to change me, to make us all more committed people to producing results? Don't waste your time doing frivolous things. Don't be faithful to church. Don't be faithful to anything but the cause of Jesus to bring justice and peace to the world. Let that be your litmus test. Because the scary thing out of all of this is what we do with that $90,000 this year, and what we do with our time and our effort that we spend around everything that we're doing as a church. What we do with all of that will either define us as faithful or lazy and wicked. According to this parable, anytime you're given something, what you do with that will either define you as lazy or faithful, as wicked or faithful. And by the way, it is wicked that across America, churches spend exorbitant amounts to keep buildings functioning while people are dehydrated and dying in other countries. That is wicked. It is wicked that you won't just let your dumb dream of keeping a church's doors open die. You won't let your church die, but you'll let thousands of people die every year. That is the definition of insanity, but it has been the definition of faithfulness for far too long. And so today, may that dumb definition of faithfulness die, and may we embrace the demand to produce results. Now, by the way, last thing I'll say about this. When I say results, I do not mean a mega church. I don't mean that you become a Christian celebrity. I just mean that you literally can say, I know where my effort's going. This is the good that has come about into the world because of what I've done. That's all I mean. Like someone was affected by the time, the effort, and the money you spent. That's all I mean. I do not mean that you're going to do something that would become a book that you could make a New York Times bestseller. I don't mean that. I just mean that there are people that were changed because of something you did or some money you spent. That's all I mean. That you can have demonstrable, tangible results to what you've done. That's it. That's all I mean. And that can be so small. But for so many people, that's actually non-existent. And that's what I want to get away from. Non-existent, the very clear, intentional spending of money, time, and effort in comparison to what we could do with that money, time, and effort if we were spending it on other places. So let's not let people die so that our dreams can live. Let's let our dreams die so that people can live. I'll pray. God, help us to be faithful. Help us to listen to this parable and to be determined to never dig a hole and to put our resources in it because we were afraid to not take enough risks, or that we were afraid to be afraid of what people may think, or the controversy that it may cause, or because our dreams may have to die. Father, help us to hold very loosely these things that come across our lives, whether it be money or the time or the energy that we have. And God, be very intentional about how we spend those three things. And God, may tangible, calculated results be the end result of what we accomplished this year, because we slowed down in January to be very careful and ensure that we are not a lazy and wicked servant of these things, but that we are a faithful and wise and shrewd servant of the gold bags that you've given us. May 2017 be the most remarkable year that any one of us has ever lived because of what we as individuals accomplish and then what we corporately accomplish together. God, I pray for at least a threefold increase over the results that we saw in 2016. May we figure out how to move some things around, whether it's time and effort or money, in order to get to a 300% increase on the demonstrable, tangible results that we see from the efforts that we put out into the world. And Lord, it may not be that easy to measure. It may not be that clear. But at least let us be clear and let us be specific as we define what those goals are, as we head out into this journey into 2017. And let us be very specific there, and very calculated there. I ask these things through Jesus. Amen. That's it. Thank you. May God bless you.